Hello, beautiful friends. I am Laurel Bleadon-Maffei with Illuminating Souls, and I welcome you to this episode of Sleepy Bedtime Blessings, a podcast to help you relax, rest, and hopefully drift off into a beautiful experience of sleep. If we're meeting for the first time, I am an angelic practitioner, a spiritual teacher, and an encourager of souls. And during my waking hours, I love to connect with people and help them connect with their angels and also help them remember the magic in their souls. And I do this through angel readings and soul mentoring and different classes. And I also have a Facebook page where I post inspiring messages each day. And I am blessed to get to do the work of my soul that I love, and that I get to meet so many of you, and I get to experience how amazing you are with the big, beautiful hearts that you have and the way you want to shine your light in this world. And every day, I feel so blessed to be here on this journey with you. And as a part of my journey, I find that I really have to take good care of myself. It's important that I focus on self-care. And a part of my self-care is sleep. And the truth is, for most of my life, I have been a very good sleeper, and for that I am grateful. But a few years ago, things began to shift for me a little bit. It could have been the age I was at or what was happening in the world. But as my cycle of sleep began to change, I found tremendous comfort and companionship and grace by using sleep podcasts. I still use them to this day. I love my life. It's a beautiful life, and I love getting to go to sleep. And so I put my earbuds in and I cozy on into my covers and I pick an episode of a sleep podcast to listen to. So this may be your first experience with a sleep podcast. And if it is, I'm going to offer you a few suggestions. I find it helpful to use earphones. There's something deeply intimate about putting in the earbuds and hearing a loving, soothing voice, lulling me to sleep. And I know it may sound a little peculiar to be creating an hour's worth of content several times a week with the hope that you won't hear most of it because you'll be sleeping. But that's the beauty of it, that you are going to have an hour of loving, soothing company to help you as you transition from wake to sleep. The other thing that can be really helpful, where this podcast can support you, is if you are someone who gets those 3 a.m. wake-up calls from the universe. If you know, you know, right? So if you find yourself awake in the wee hours of the morning, instead of letting your mind get busy with all the thoughts, you can listen to this podcast. And I'll tell you a bedtime story. And even if for some reason you don't fall asleep, I promise I'll be good company for you. So I want to invite you to get cozy and comfortable if you're not already there. And I'm going to invite the angels in to join us here. The angels are divine beings of light, filled with love. And whether you believe that angels exist, or if you just want to imagine them as figures in a fairy tale, one way or another you will get to experience the beauty of their presence. So take a beautiful breath in and out. And beautiful, beloved angels, I invite you to join us here. And I am so deeply grateful for the love you are shining upon us all. I ask that you infuse this broadcast with love, with healing, with a deep sense of well-being. And I ask that each beloved soul who listens to this broadcast receive blessings of love. I ask that they connect with their most creative, inspired self. I ask that their path be paved with ease and grace. And I am so grateful to be here with you. So allow the angels to shine their love upon you. And this love, it's beyond unconditional. There is nothing you could ever do or have ever done that would cause your angels to turn away from you. They understand how complicated the human journey is. And they have tremendous compassion and understanding for how complex it gets at times. So in this moment, the invitation for you is to simply receive and allow yourself to be loved. You are a blessing in this world. You are preparing to open up to even more of your unique gifts and abilities. There are prayers that you have already brought forth to God and the angels, and they want you to know that they hear you and that the angels are amplifying the prayers of your heart. You, dear one, are worthy of receiving goodness. You are worthy of kindness. And you are worthy of a life that brings you a sense of fulfillment. So allow your body to relax and allow yourself to complete the energies of this day that has been, so that you can be transported into a sense of rest and well-being. Your soul is filled with light, and this light is helping you remember your way. You are doing so much better than you know. And we affirm in this moment that when tomorrow arrives, it will arrive with blessings in your name. I am so deeply grateful for the gift of you. Even if we have never met, I feel the true beauty of your spirit. I feel the love with which you hold this world in your heart. And I am honored to get to spend this time with you. So you tuck in tight, you cozy up. It's okay for you to let go and sleep, and the angels will watch over you. And I'm going to read you a bedtime story. Tonight's story is the next installment of A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett. It was one of my favorite books growing up, and I went back and reread it a few months ago and fell in love with it all over again. So we're going to pick up tonight. We're sort of in the middle of chapter 3. And to bring you up to speed, the story is about Sarah Crew, a little girl who gets sent away to Miss Minchin's seminary, which is a boarding school for young women in London. Her father is stationed in India. He is known as Captain Crew, and he has just brought her there. And she's finding her way. Her father is very wealthy and loving and indulgent. And he has outfitted Sarah with everything she could possibly ever need and want, including a very special doll named Emily. And we're joining the story while all of the young ladies are in Miss Minchin's classroom. And there was just an incident with Monsieur Defarge, who is the French teacher, and the recognition that Sarah's French is flawless, which puts Miss Minchin ill at ease. And Sarah is gaining the attention of the other girls, including Ermengarde. And this is where we pick up our story. When lessons were over and the pupils gathered together in groups to talk, Sarah looked for Miss St. John, and finding her bundled rather discontently in a window seat, she walked over to her and spoke. She only said the kind of thing little girls always say to each other by way of beginning an acquaintance, but there was something friendly about Sarah, and people always felt it. "What is your name?" she said. To explain Miss St. John's amazement, one must recall that a new pupil is, for a short time, a somewhat uncertain thing. And of this new pupil, the entire school had talked the night before until it fell asleep quite exhausted by excitement and contradictory stories. A new pupil with a carriage and a pony and a maid and a voyage from India to discuss was not an ordinary acquaintance. "My name's Ermengarde St. John," she answered. "Mine is Sarah Crewe," said Sarah. "Yours is very pretty. It sounds like a storybook." "Do you like it?" fluttered Ermengarde. I like yours." Miss St. John's chief trouble in life was that she had a clever father. Sometimes this seemed to her a dreadful calamity. If you have a father who knows everything, who speaks 7 or 8 languages, and has thousands of volumes, which he has apparently learned by heart, he frequently expects you to be familiar with the contents of your lesson books at least, and it is not improbable that he will feel you ought to be able to remember a few incidents of history and to write a French exercise. Ermengarde was a severe trial to Mr. St. John. He could not understand how a child of his own could be notably and unmistakably dull, who never shone in anything. "Good heavens," he had said more than once as he stared at her. "There are times when I think she is as stupid as her Aunt Eliza." If her Aunt Eliza had been slow to learn and quick to forget a thing entirely when she had learned it, Ermengarde was strikingly like her. She was the monumental dunce of the school, and it could not be denied. "She must be made to learn," her father said to Miss Minchin. Consequently, Ermengarde spent the greater part of her life in disgrace or in tears. She learned things and forgot them, or if she remembered them, she did not understand them. So it was natural that, having made Sarah's acquaintance, she should sit and stare at her with profound admiration. "You can speak French, can't you?" she said respectfully. Sarah got onto the window seat, which was a big, deep one, and tucking up her feet, sat with her hands clasped around her knees. "I can speak it because I have heard it all my life," she answered. "You could speak it if you had always heard it." Oh no, I couldn't, said Ermengarde. I never could speak it. Why? Inquired Sarah curiously. Ermengarde shook her head so that the pigtail wobbled. You heard me just now, she said. I am always like that. I can't say the words, they're so queer. She paused a moment and then added with a touch of awe in her voice, You are clever, aren't you? Sarah looked out of the window into the dingy square where the sparrows were hopping and twittering on the wet iron railings and the sooty branches of the trees. She reflected a few moments. She had heard it said very often that she was clever, and she wondered if she was, and if she was, how it happened. I don't know, she said, I can't tell. Then seeing a mournful look on the round, chubby face, she gave a little laugh and changed the subject. Would you like to see Emily? She inquired. Who is Emily? Ermengarde asked, just as Miss Minchin had done. Come up to my room and see, said Sarah, holding out her hand. They jumped down from the window seat together and went upstairs. Is it true? Ermengarde whispered as they went through the hall. Is it true that you have a playroom all to yourself? Yes, Sarah answered. Papa asked Miss Minchin to let me have one because, well, it was because when I play I make up stories and tell them to myself, and I don't like people to hear me. It spoils it if I think people listen. They had reached the passage leading to Sarah's room by this time, and Ermengarde stopped short, staring, and quite losing her breath. You make up stories? She gasped. Can you do that as well as speak French? Can you? Sarah looked at her in simple surprise. Why, anyone can make up things, she said. Have you never tried? She put her hand warmly on Ermengarde's. Let us go very quietly to the door, she whispered. And then I will open it quite suddenly, and perhaps we may catch her. She was half laughing, but there was a touch of mysterious hope in her eyes, which fascinated Ermengarde, though she had not the remotest idea what it meant, or whom it was that she wanted to catch, or why she wanted to catch her. Whatsoever she meant, Ermengarde was sure it was something delightfully exciting. So quite thrilled with expectation, she followed on her tiptoe along the passage. They made not the least noise until they reached the door. Then Sarah suddenly turned the handle and threw it wide open. Its opening revealed the room quite neat and quiet, a fire gently burning in the grate, and a wonderful doll sitting in a chair by it, apparently reading a book. Oh, she got back to her seat before we could see her, Sarah explained. Of course they always do. They are quick as lightning. Ermengarde looked from her to the doll and back again. Can she walk? She asked breathlessly. Yes, answered Sarah. At least I believe she can, and at least I pretend I believe she can, and that makes it seem as if it were true. Have you never pretended things? No, said Ermengarde, never. Tell me about it. She was so bewitched by this odd new companion that she actually stared at Sarah instead of at Emily, notwithstanding that Emily was the most attractive doll person she had ever seen. Let us sit down, said Sarah, and I will tell you. It's so easy that when you begin, you can't stop. You just go on and on, doing it always. And it's beautiful, Emily. You must listen. This is Ermengarde St. John, Emily. Ermengarde, this is Emily. Would you like to hold her? Oh, may I, said Ermengarde. May I really? She is beautiful. And Emily was put into her arms. Never in her dull short life had Miss St. John dreamed of such an hour as the one she spent with the new queer pupil before they heard the lunch bell ring and they were obliged to go downstairs. Sarah sat upon the hearth rug and told her strange things. She sat rather huddled up, and her green eyes shone and her cheeks flushed. She told stories of the voyage and stories of India. But what fascinated Ermengarde the most was her fancy about the dolls who walked and talked and who could do anything they chose when the human beings were out of the room, but who must keep their powers a secret and so flew back to their places like lightning when people returned to the room. We couldn't do it, said Sarah seriously. You see, it's kind of magic. Once she was relating the story of the search for Emily, Ermengarde saw her face suddenly change. A cloud seemed to pass over it and put out the light in her shining eyes. She drew her breath in so sharply that it made a funny, sad little sound, and then she shut her lips and held them tightly closed, as if she was determined either to do or not to do something. Ermengarde had an idea that if she had been like any other little girl, she might have suddenly burst out sobbing and crying, but she did not. Have you a pain? Ermengarde ventured. Yes, Sarah answered, after a moment's silence. But it is not in my body. Then she added something in a low voice, which she tried to keep quite steady, and it was this. Do you love your father more than anything else in all the whole world? Ermengarde's mouth fell open a little. She knew that it would be far from behaving like a respectable child at a select seminary to say that it never had occurred to you that you could love your father, that you would do anything desperate to avoid being left alone in his society for 10 minutes. She was, indeed, greatly embarrassed. I scarcely ever see him, she stammered. He is always in the library reading things. I love mine more than all the world 10 times over, Sarah said. That is what my pain is. He has gone away. She put her head quietly down on her little huddled up knees and sat very still for a few minutes. She's going to cry out loud, thought Ermengarde fearfully. But she did not. Her short black locks tumbled about her ears, and she sat still. And then she spoke without lifting her head. I promised him I would bear it, she said, and I will. You have to bear things. Think what soldiers bear. Papa is a soldier. If there was a war, he would have to bear marching and thirstiness and perhaps deep wounds. And he would never say a word, not one word. Ermengarde could only gaze at her, but she felt that she was beginning to adore her. She was so wonderful and different from anyone else. Presently she lifted her face and shook back her black locks with a queer little smile. "If I go on talking and talking," she said, "and telling you things about pretending, I shall bear it better. You don't forget, but you bear it better." Ermengarde did not know why a lump came to her throat, and her eyes felt as if tears were in them. "Lavinia and Jessie are best friends," she said rather huskily. "I wish we could be best friends. Would you ever have me for yours? You're clever, and I'm the stupidest child in the world, but oh, I do so like you." "I'm glad of that," said Sarah. "It makes you thankful when you are liked. Yes, we will be friends. And I'll tell you what," a sudden gleam lighting her face, "I can help you with your French lessons." Chapter 4, Lottie. If Sarah had been a different kind of child, the life she led at Miss Minchin's Select Seminary for the next few years would not have been at all good for her. She was treated more as if she were a distinguished guest at the establishment than as if she were a mere little girl. If she had been a self-opinionated, domineering child, she might have become disagreeable enough to be unbearable through being so much indulged and flattered. If she had been an indolent child, she would have learned nothing. Privately, Miss Minchin disliked her, but she was far too worldly a woman to do or say anything which might make such a desirable pupil wish her to leave her school. She knew quite well that if Sarah wrote to her papa to tell him she was uncomfortable or unhappy, Captain Crewe would remove her at once. Miss Minchin's opinion was that if a child were continually praised and never forbidden to do what she liked, she would be sure to be fond of the place where she was so treated. Accordingly, Sarah was praised for her quickness at her lessons, for her good manners, for her amiability to her fellow pupils, for her generosity if she gave 6 pence to a beggar out of her full little purse. The simplest thing she did was treated as if it were a virtue. And if she had not had a disposition and a clever little brain, she might have been very self-satisfied as a young person. But the clever little brain told her a great many sensible and true things about herself and her circumstances, and now and then she talked these things over to Ermengarde as times went on. "Things happen to people by accident," she used to say. "A lot of nice accidents have happened to me. It just happened that I always liked lessons and books and could remember things when I learned them. It just happened that I was born with a father who was beautiful and nice and clever and could give me everything I liked. Perhaps I have not really a good temper at all, but if you have everything you want and everyone is kind to you, how can you help but be good-tempered? I don't know," looking quite serious, "how I shall ever find out whether I am really a nice child or a horrid one. Perhaps I'm a hideous child and no one will ever know just because I have never had any trials." "Lavinia has no trials," said Ermengarde stolidly, "and she is horrid enough." Sarah rubbed the end of her little nose reflectively as she thought the matter over. "Well," she said at last, perhaps that is because Lavinia is growing." This was the result of a charitable recollection of having heard Miss Amelia say that Lavinia was growing so fast that she believed it affected her health and temper. Lavinia, in fact, was spiteful. She was jealous of Sarah. Until the new pupil's arrival, she had felt herself the leader in the school. She had led because she was capable of making herself extremely disagreeable if the others did not follow her. She domineered over the children and assumed grand airs with those big enough to be her companions. She was rather pretty and had been the best-dressed pupil in the procession when the select seminary walked out 2 by 2 until Sarah's velvet coats and sable muffs appeared, combined with drooping ostrich feathers, and were led by Miss Minchin at the head of the line. This, at the beginning, had been bitter enough. But as time went on, it became apparent that Sarah was a leader too, and not because she could make herself disagreeable, but because she never did. There's one thing about Sarah Crewe Jessie had enraged her best friend by saying honestly. She's never grand about herself the least bit, and you know she might be lavvy. I believe I couldn't help being just a little if I had so many fine things and was made such a fuss over. It's disgusting the way Miss Minchin shows her off when parents come. Dear Sarah must come into the drawing room and talk to Mrs. Musgrave about India, mimicked Lavinia in her most highly flavored imitation of Miss Minchin. Dear Sarah must speak French to Lady Pitkin. Her accent is so perfect. She didn't learn her French at the seminary at any rate, and there's nothing so clever in her knowing it. She says herself she didn't learn it at all, she just picked it up because she always heard her papa speaking it. And as to her papa, there is nothing so grand in being an Indian officer. She's always doing something silly, snapped Lavinia. My mamma says that way of hers of pretending things is silly. She says she will grow up eccentric. It was quite true that Sarah was never grand. She was a friendly little soul and shared her privileges and belongings with a free hand. The little ones, who were accustomed to being disdained and ordered out of the way by the mature ladies aged 10 and 12, were never made to cry by this most envied of them all. She was a motherly young person, and when people fell down and scraped their knees, she ran and helped them up and patted them, or found in her pocket a bonbon or some other article of a soothing nature. She never pushed them out of her way or alluded to their years as a humiliation and a blot upon their small characters. If you are 4, you are 4, she said severely to Lavinia on an occasion of her having, it must be confessed, slapped Lottie and called her a brat. But you will be 5 next year, and 6 the year after that, and, opening large convicting eyes, it takes 16 years to make you 20. Dear me, said Lavinia, how we can calculate. In fact, it was not to be denied that 16 and 4 made 20, and 20 was an age the most daring we are scarcely bold enough to dream of. So the younger children adored Sarah. More than once she had been known to have a tea party made up of these despised ones in her own room. And Emily had been played with, and Emily's own tea service used, the one with cups which held quite a lot of much sweetened weak tea and had blue flowers on them. No one had seen such a very real doll's tea set before. From that afternoon, Sarah was regarded as a goddess and a queen by the entire alphabet class. Lottie Lay worshipped her to such an extent that if Sarah had not been a motherly person, she would have found her tiresome. Lottie had been sent to school by a rather flighty young papa who could not imagine what else to do with her. Her young mother had died, and as the child had been treated like a favorite doll or a very spoiled pet monkey or a lapdog ever since the first hour of her life, she was a very appalling little creature. When she wanted anything or did not want anything, she wept and howled, and as she always wanted the things she could not have and did not want the things that were best for her, her shrill little voice was usually to be heard uplifted in wails in one part of the house or another. Her strongest weapon was that in some mysterious way she had found out that a very small girl who had lost her mother was a person who ought to be pitied and made much of. She had probably heard some grown-up people talking her over in the early days after her mother's death, so it became her habit to make great use of this knowledge. The first time Sarah took her in charge was one morning when, on passing a sitting room, she heard both Miss Minchin and Miss Amelia trying to suppress the angry wails of some child who, evidently, refused to be silenced. She refused so strenuously indeed that Miss Minchin was obliged to almost shout in a stately and a severe manner to make herself heard. "What is she crying for?" she almost yelled. Oh, Sarah heard. "I haven't got any mama." "Oh, Lottie," screamed Miss Amelia. "Do stop, darling. Don't cry. Please don't." "Oh," Lottie howled tempestuously. "Haven't got any mama." "She ought to be whipped," Miss Minchin proclaimed. "You shall be whipped, you naughty child." Lottie wailed more loudly than ever. Miss Amelia began to cry. Miss Minchin's voice rose until it almost thundered. Then suddenly she sprang up from her chair in impotent indignation and flounced out of the room, leaving Miss Amelia to arrange the matter. Sarah had paused in the hall, wondering if she ought to go into the room, because she had recently begun a friendly acquaintance with Lottie and might be able to quiet her. When Miss Minchin came out and saw her, she looked rather annoyed. She realized that her voice, as heard from inside the room, could not have sounded either dignified or amiable. "Oh, Sarah," she exclaimed, endeavoring to produce a suitable smile. "I stopped," explained Sarah, "because I knew it was Lottie, and I thought perhaps, just perhaps, I could make her be quiet." "May I try, Miss Minchin?" "If you can, you are a clever child," answered Miss Minchin, drawing in her mouth sharply. Then, seeing that Sarah looked slightly chilled by her asperity, she changed her manner. "But you are clever in everything," she said in her approving way. "I dare say, if you can manage her, go in," and she left her. When Sarah entered the room, Lottie was lying upon the floor, screaming and kicking her small fat legs violently, and Miss Amelia was bending over her in consternation and despair, looking quite red and damp with heat. Lottie had always found, when in her own nursery at home, that kicking and screaming would always be quieted by any means she insisted on. Poor plump Miss Amelia was trying first one method and then another. "Poor darling," she said one moment. "I know you haven't any mamma. Poor..." And then in quite another tone, "If you don't stop, Lottie, I will shake you. Poor little angel there. You wicked, bad, detestable child, I will smack you. I will." Sarah went to them quietly. She did not know at all what she was going to do, but she had a vague inward conviction that it would be better not to say such different kinds of things quite so helplessly and excitedly. "Miss Amelia," she said in a low voice, "Miss Minchin says I may try to make her stop. May I?" Miss Amelia turned and looked at her hopelessly. "Oh, do you think you can?" she gasped. "I don't know whether I can," answered Sarah, still in her half-whisper, "but I will try." Miss Amelia stumbled up from her knees with a heavy sigh, and Lottie's fat little legs kicked as hard as ever. "If you will steal out of the room," said Sarah, "I will stay with her." "Oh, Sarah," almost whimpered Miss Amelia, "we never had such a dreadful child before. I don't believe we can keep her." But she crept out of the room and was very much relieved to find an excuse for doing so. Sarah stood by the howling, furious child for a few moments and looked down at her without saying anything. Then she sat down flat on the floor beside her and waited. Except for Lottie's angry screams, the room was quite quiet. This was a new state of affairs for little Miss Lay, who was accustomed, when she screamed, to hear other people's protest and implore and command and coax by turns, to lie and kick and shriek, and to find the only person near you, not seeming to mind in the least, attracted her attention. She opened her tight-shut, streaming eyes to see who this person was, and it was only another little girl. But it was the one who owned Emily and all the nice things, and she was looking at her steadily and as if she was merely thinking. Having paused for a few seconds to find this out, Lottie thought she must begin again, but the quiet of the room and of Sarah's odd, interested face made her first howl rather half-hearted. "I haven't any mamma," she announced, but her voice was not so strong. Sarah looked at her still more steadily, but with a sort of understanding in her eyes. "Neither have I," she said. This was so unexpected that it was astounding. Lottie actually dropped her legs, gave a wriggle, and lay and stared. A new idea will stop a child crying when nothing else will. Also, it was true that while Lottie disliked Miss Minchin, who was cross, and Miss Amelia, who was foolishly indulgent, she rather liked Sarah, little as she knew her. She did not want to give up her grievance, but her thoughts were distracted from it, so she wriggled again after a sulky sob, said, "Where is she?" Sarah paused for a moment because she had been told that her mamma was in heaven. She had thought a great deal about the matter, and her thoughts had not been quite like those of other people. "She went to heaven," she said, "but I am sure she comes out sometimes to see me, though I don't see her. So does yours. Perhaps they can both see us now, Perhaps they are both in this room. Lottie sat bolt upright and looked about her. She was a pretty little curly-headed creature, and her round eyes were like wet forget-me-nots. If her mamma had seen her during the last half hour, she might not have thought her the kind of child who ought to be related to an angel. Sarah went on talking. Perhaps some people might think that what she said was rather like a fairy story, but it was all so real to her own imagination that Lottie began to listen in spite of herself. She had been told that her mamma had wings and a crown, and that she had been shown pictures of ladies in beautiful white nightgowns who were said to be angels. But Sarah seemed to be telling a real story about a lovely country where real people were. There are fields and fields of flowers, she said, forgetting herself as usual when she began, and talking rather if she were in a dream. Fields and fields of lilies, and when the soft wind blows over them, it wafts the scent of them into the air, and everybody always breathes it because the soft wind is always blowing. And little children run about in the lily fields and gather armfuls of them and laugh and make little wreaths, and the streets are shining. And people are never tired, however far they walk. They can float anywhere they like, and there are walls made of pearl and gold all around the city. But they are low enough for the people to go and lean on them and look down onto the earth and smile and send beautiful messages. Whatsoever story she had begun to tell, Lottie would, no doubt, have stopped crying and been fascinated into listening. But there was no denying that this story was prettier than others. She dragged herself close to Sarah and drank in every word until the end came far too soon. When it did come, she was so sorry that she put her lip up ominously. "I want to go there," she cried. "I haven't any mama in this school." Sarah saw the danger signal and came out of her dream. She took hold of the chubby hand and pulled her close to her side with a coaxing little laugh. "I will be your mama," she said. "We will play that you are my little girl and Emily shall be your sister." Lottie's dimples all began to show themselves. "Shall we?" she said. "Yes," answered Sarah, jumping up to her feet. "Let us go and tell her, and then I will wash your face and brush your hair," to which Lottie agreed quite cheerfully, and trotted out of the room and upstairs with her, without seeming even to remember that the whole of the last hour's tragedy had been caused by the fact that she had refused to be washed and brushed for lunch, and Miss Minchin had been called in to use her majestic authority. And from that time Sarah was an adopted mother. Chapter 5. Becky. Of course, the greatest power Sarah possessed, and the one which gained her even more followers than her luxuries, and the fact that she was the show pupil, the power that Lavinia and certain other girls were most envious of, and at the same time most fascinated by in spite of themselves, was her power of telling stories, and of making everything she talked about seem like a story, whether it was one or not. Anyone who has been at school with a teller of stories knows what the wonder means, how he or she is followed about and besought in a whisper to relate romances, how groups gather round and hang on the outskirts of the favored party in the hope of being allowed to join in and listen. Sarah not only could tell stories, but she adored telling them. When she sat or stood in the midst of a circle and began to invent wonderful things, her green eyes grew big and shining. Her cheeks flushed, and without knowing that she was doing it, she began to act and made what she told lovely or alarming by the raising or dropping of her voice, the bend and sway of her slim body, and the dramatic movements of her hands. She forgot that she was talking to listening children. She saw and lived with the fairy folk or the kings and queens and beautiful ladies whose adventures she was narrating. Sometimes, when she had finished her story, she was quite out of breath with excitement and would lay her hand on her thin little quick-rising chest and half laugh as if at herself. "When I am telling it," she would say, "it doesn't seem as if it were only made up. It seems more real than you are, more real than the schoolroom. I feel as if I were all the people in the story, one after the other." She had been at Miss Minchin's school about 2 years, when one foggy winter's afternoon, as she was getting out of her carriage comfortably wrapped in her warmest velvets and furs, and looking very much grander than she knew, she caught sight, as she crossed the pavement, of a dingy little figure standing on the area steps and stretching its neck so that its wide-open eyes might peer at her through the railings. Something in the eagerness and timidity of the smudgy face made her look at it, and when she looked, she smiled because it was her way to smile at people. But the owner of the smudgy face and the wide-open eyes evidently was afraid that she ought not to have been caught looking at pupils of importance. She dodged out of sight like a jack-in-the-box and scurried back into the kitchen, disappearing so suddenly that if she had not been such a poor little forlorn thing, Sarah would have laughed in spite of herself. That very evening, as Sarah was sitting in the midst of a group of listeners in a corner of the schoolroom telling one of her stories, the very same figure timidly entered the room, carrying a coal box much too heavy for her, and knelt down upon the hearth rug to replenish the fire and sweep up the ashes. She was cleaner than she had been when she peeped through the area railings, but she looked just as frightened. She was evidently afraid to look at the children or seemed to be listening. She put on pieces of coal cautiously with her fingers so that she might make no disturbing noise, and she swept about the fire irons very softly. But Sarah saw in 2 minutes that she was deeply interested in what was going on, and that she was doing her work slowly in the hope of catching a word here and there. And realizing this, she raised her voice and spoke more clearly. The mermaids swam softly about in the crystal green water, and dragged after them a fishing net woven of deep-sea pearls, she said. The princess sat on the white rock and watched them. It was a wonderful story about a princess who was loved by a prince merman and went to live with him in shining caves under the sea. The small drudge before the gate swept the hearth once and then swept it again. Having done it twice, she did it 3 times. And as she was doing it for the 3rd time, the sound of the story so lured her to listen that she fell under the spell and actually forgot that she had no right to listen at all, and also forgot everything else. She sat down upon her heels as she knelt on the hearth rug, and the brush hung idly in her fingers. The voice of the storyteller went on and drew her with it into the winding grottos under the sea, glowing with soft, clear blue light and paved with pure golden strands. Strange sea flowers and grasses waved about her, and far away faint singing and music echoed. The hearth brush fell from the work-roughened hands, and Lavinia Herbert looked around. "That girl has been listening," she said. The culprit snatched up her brush and scrambled to her feet. She caught at the coal box and simply scuttled out of the room like a frightened rabbit. Sarah felt rather hot-tempered. "I knew she was listening," she said. "Why shouldn't she?" Lavinia tossed her head with great elegance. "Well," she remarked, "I do not know whether your mamma would like you to tell stories to servant girls, but I know my mamma wouldn't like me to do it." "My mamma," said Sarah, looking odd. "I don't believe she would mind in the least. She knows that stories belong to everybody." "I thought," retorted Lavinia in severe recollection, "that your mamma was dead. How can she know things?" "Do you think she doesn't know things?" said Sarah in her stern little voice. Sometimes she had a rather stern little voice. "Sarah's mamma knows everything," piped in Lottie. "So does my mamma, except Sarah is my mamma at Miss Minchin's. My other one knows everything. The streets are shining, and there are fields and fields of lilies, and everyone gathers them. Sarah tells me when she puts me to bed." "You wicked thing," said Lavinia, turning on Sarah, "making fairy stories about heaven." "There are much more splendid stories in Revelation," returned Sarah. "Just look and see. How do you know mine are fairy stories? But I can tell you, with a fine bit of unheavenly temper, you will never find out whether they are or not if you're not kinder to people than you are now. Come along, Lottie." And she marched out of the room, rather hoping that she might see the little servant again somewhere. But she found no trace of her when she got into the hall. And with that, my beloved friends, the angels and I wish you a blessed rest, and we'll come together again soon. You are loved. You are precious, and you are a blessing in this world.